Okay, I want to make it clear first is that this is not a homophobic video. I am actually part of the community myself, so if you thought this was a video to spread your own hateful ideology, then you're mistaken. Um, but you are welcome to stay if you really want to, and maybe you'll learn something. But yeah. Okay, now with that being said, my name is Amani Ash, and today I am going to be talking about homophobia and how, as a concept, it unfortunately kind of makes sense why it is. Just hear me out first, because I think a lot of people in our community and a lot of our allies, they often just see these people as bigoted or maybe misinformed. But I think, honestly, it goes a little bit deeper than that, and that's what I want to talk about today, because a lot of the times it's how they were raised, what values they had when they were, growing up, or, the representation that they saw when they were growing up, that all play a part. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today, because I think that a lot of people, they try to broaden the topic instead of like going deeper into it. So yeah, with that being said, I want to talk about my own personal biases first, because that's kind of what led me to wanting to make this video in the first place, is kind of realizing that I have biases of my own, and I think that it's important to talk about those and, recognize those. Throughout my life, I've had, many different experiences with different types of people, but the main thing that I noticed over time is kind of my disdain for...
Hey, Lindsay? I wish you didn't smoke weed.
Now, growing up, I was surrounded by people who smoked, and whether it was cigarettes or weed, or later on, once vaping started to become a thing, if you even can consider that smoking, I didn't understand it. As someone who had has a very sensitive sense of smell, I did not understand it. It didn't make any sense to me why someone would inhale toxic chemicals into their body. Now, that confusion never really outright turned into dislike for those people until later in my life. That didn't really turn into, prejudice, I guess. Prejudice would be a better word to say. And it didn't really begin to form until my brothers began to reach the age where they started smoking. And honestly, this is where things started to shift a little bit, because I watched these people that I grew up with start to turn into almost completely different people in my eyes. Anytime I hung out with them, they reeked of cannabis and they would act like a fool. Not only was it physically difficult to hang out with them because of the awful smell, but it was also kind of embarrassing as well. Like, I would watch them try to act like they were sober when clearly they weren't. And it was painfully obvious to everyone as well. And that behavior kind of changed the way that I viewed them as people. At the time, that was really the only, representation of weed smokers that I had ever known. I will never forget the time that I got picked up from work by my brother, and he smelled like weed, and also he was acting like, crazy, basically. And he walked in, he was talking to my coworkers, and I did not like it because I didn't want to be associated with that, basically. And I think that when you have moments like this, it kind of sits with you like a lot longer than you even realize that it's sitting with you for, because it forms your thoughts. And that definitely was a defining moment for me. It definitely, it kind of gave me an insight on what a weed smoker is and what type of people they are, because I always had that experience, from my brothers. Now, of course, I had, my experiences, but I think the biggest thing that pushed me over the edge and kind of changed my mind on weed smokers is kind of the media's portrayal of weed.
What's going on here? Sarah? Sarah.
She won't answer you. Or she can't.
Why not?
This is the way it's been since she started smoking pot. She's all lazy and boring, and we used to have so much fun together.
Now, growing up in the 2010s, and yes, I'm young, it was kind of completely different than it is now. Now, Washington and Colorado didn't legalize weed until 2012. So even as I was growing up, the country was still in a very slow shift. And I remember, the news always being flooded with people getting arrested for having weed. And not only that, people getting heavy sentences for having it, sentences that are longer than some violent crimes out there. So if the law is explicitly stating that, weed was bad, then the people using it, obviously, they had to be bad people, right? Now, in my mind, I had no reason to doubt anything because everything I had seen and heard and experienced, it all kind of led to one individual point. And it's that weed smokers were bad. They were, fools. They acted crazy and they went to prison like they deserved to. It kind of, equivalates to how people begin to have, these prejudiced thoughts, to begin with. Anytime I found out that someone smoked weed, for me, it kind of gave me a sign that I was better than them. And honestly, after realizing that, I really didn't like it. It wasn't a good feeling to feel because it honestly put me into the shoes of what I imagine people who are homophobic or transphobic or, whatever, and what they think and what they feel like. As soon as they found out that someone, maybe is a guy and they like guys, a girl, they like girls, or they're trans, I'm sure that their mind automatically thinks differently about them, even if it's voluntary or not. And for me, kind of jumping into that mindset, I didn't like that. I knew that something had to change. But this is how the story goes most of the time. These people don't realize that they've been conditioned until it's pretty much already too late. Now, homophobia, or any form of prejudice for that matter, it takes a very, very long time to form. It's something that's learned over time. And I would liken it to something like a disease where, it slowly spreads until, one day you realize, oh shit, I have these biases and I didn't even know. Now, I feel like every single interaction you have, everything you see, everything you hear growing up, it all shapes your perspective towards any particular thing. It doesn't matter if it's, something like, your thoughts on trans people, gay people, different races, whatever. But generally, what do you think happens when these people that are told their entire lives that being gay is wrong or that being trans is a mental illness, what happens when they grow up? Well, they grow up to be what we call bigots basically now, because that's what they were taught. That's what they were learned throughout their entire childhood. And while I am not making an excuse for that, because I will get into that later, so don't think I'm excusing it, I do think it is something that we have to, talk about and look into more. Now, especially over the last 20 years, and honestly, more specifically over the past 7 or 8 years, the push for LGBTQ rights has been heavily demonized, especially within the media, which makes it extremely hard for us to see anything positive about our community. And since the media constantly portrays the minorities of our community as the absolute majority, then it makes it really hard for people to see good coverage on, us as people. There are a lot of great artists, YouTubers, music creators, whatever, that are in the LGBT community, except the media does not focus on those people. They focus on the stories that create outrage. And this is honestly how we end up in situations where, let's say, a trans shooter, for example, they get media coverage for months and months on end, while, let's say a white shooter is treated as an individual event. And that's not something that they do on accident. That is very much an intentional thing, because that is exactly what people want to see. They don't want to see, the same thing that's happened hundreds and hundreds of times. They want to see news that confirms their own biases. This is why I think that it is incredibly, incredibly difficult for someone who lives in a tiny community, or what I like to call nowhere towns, where it's just completely one group of people. It's very difficult to not be prejudiced when you don't have experiences with other groups of people. Why do you think that some of the most diverse places in the entire, world basically are also some of the most progressive places that you'll see? And when you have these consistent interactions with these people, your mind, it eventually does begin to open up. And while in some cases, your biases might initially ring true, with enough experiences, it won't hold up because not everyone is the exact same. We're all different. And I think that's something that, specifically the youth are starting to recognize a lot more. At least in my experience, I've seen that a lot of people that are my age are a lot more open to these different concepts and whatnot. Unless, there's another thing going on, which I'll talk about here in a second. But genuinely speaking, younger people are more receptive because they have had less time, one, to, develop those thoughts. And also they have had the opportunity to see different types of people, whether it be through social media or in real life, since, gay people in general are starting to become more common, as we'll say, common in quotes, because we've always been here. However, there is one thing that I have yet to talk about, and it is the thing that I think is, pushing homophobia forward even today in the modern age. And it would also be kind of disingenuous to make a video without talking about
the renewed mind is the key to the power that we need.
Now, religion has historically been a primary driver of anti-LGBTQ rights in the past, especially within Christianity, which is what I'm going to be speaking about today, mostly because that's the only thing I really have experience with. Usually, this religion pushes the idea that being gay or being trans is inherently against God's will, or it's a sin. But honestly, whether or not you believe that is completely up to you. But what there is no debate for is the fact that this is something that is completely drilled into kids' heads at such a young age that it makes it almost impossible for them to think anything else. And, they're taught to look down on us before they even know what gender or sex is. And because of that, when they grow up, they'll actively ignore anything that points to the contrary. It's almost like validating queer people would be a total betrayal of their core values and their religion. And you see this most commonly with trans people, where they choose to deny their identity because it conflicts with what they believe reality is. And for me personally, it never really exactly made sense to me how a group of people that claim to be all loving and, accepting of everyone could be so hateful all the time. To me, it never computed. But I think honestly what is happening is they don't really see it as hate. They see it as love and wanting to change the person to be the authentic self. But they don't realize that it's technically, going against that. And as much as these people, they like to say that we're, indoctrinating their children, I don't think that they realize that they've been thoroughly indoctrinated their whole lives, basically. They never really had a choice in the matter. They were, raised on these values by people who grew up in the church, probably. And I don't think that, excuses the behavior, because I think that everyone has the ability to change. But they have to have a good reason to do so. But, it explains the root of it. And I think that this conditioning, it takes on a heavy weight when it intersects with, different cultural backgrounds, which I want to touch on for a second because it is very important to me.
At the end of the day, Ronnie, I am a man.
A man who's gay. You like niggas, get that to your head.
Now, in the Black community, the church has historically been the backbone of the culture. Now, even if the younger generation is going to church less, their parents or grandparents had a high likelihood of being in that church every Sunday. And because of that, these values, they get passed on throughout the generations. I want to preface this by saying I am not trying to demonize Black people. As a Black person myself, obviously, I see that this carries a specific weight within our culture, and I've seen how it affects specifically people, who are part of the queer community. Now, growing up, I was always told that, men don't cry, or men can't paint their nails, or men don't get piercings, or whatever. On the flip side, I was also, told that women aren't supposed to get angry, women can't wear certain clothes, or women are supposed to act prim and proper all the time, especially within the presence of a man. And, these sound like gender stereotypes. And, in some cases, yes. Well, actually, in all cases, they are. This perpetuation of these gender roles is exactly what causes homophobia in these communities. Basically, the very second someone wants to step outside of these cultural norms, it is treated as a threat to our culture. And in the church, it takes these gender norms and it turns it into something that is essentially, divine law. You're supposed to do these things, otherwise you are going against God's will, basically. And I honestly think this is how you get these, families pushing these values onto their kids. Now, personally, I was very fortunate when it came to my upbringing. Moving to a more diverse school district in the 4th grade allowed me to meet all different types of people from every single different background, compared to the primarily Black school that I went to before that. And by the time I, made it to high school, I saw a pretty sharp contrast in how these different groups of people treated queer people that we saw out in the wild, whether it be, in the school itself or, online. And over time, I started to notice that, generally speaking, a lot of my Black peers had a very strong disdain against those groups of people. Now, obviously, my small size of my high school isn't really a good indicator, but it did at least tell me at the time what the trend was. And I think, kind of going back to my story about smokers, it kind of made me not really have a choice on how I saw the matter. Now, in this case particularly, I think there were a lot of people already talking about this issue online, and how, homophobia is kind of, bad in the Black community. But I didn't really get a chance to see anything other than that when I was growing up. And I think because of that, it has led me to have this kind of this tunnel vision on thinking that, maybe Black people are more homophobic. But obviously, in reality, I know that's not true, because homophobia, it's in every culture. We just do it in different ways. And the tragic, thing about it is that we're already a discriminated against group. So I find it kind of insane that we would go and discriminate against other people. To me, that, that's never made any sense. Kind of going off of what, most of us are taught growing up, it does make sense. But at the same time, it doesn't, because we don't really have any evidence to the contrary. We just kind of believe and go with whatever is taught to us, because that's all we know. Now, there are definitely some Black folks out there pushing their support for the queer community, except the problem is that a lot of those people belong to the community themselves. So the bar isn't really being pushed super far when it comes to that. And I think that that's honestly quite sad, that we don't have a lot of supporters outside of the, queer community in the Black community. And again, I have to go back and kind of recognize my own privilege in this fact that I was never really raised on these super strict religious values. In fact, most of my life I grew up being essentially an atheist, because no one really told me anything about religion or those values. While of course they're always going to be perpetuated regardless, even if you want them to be or not, they weren't really heavily pushed on me. So I was able to, maybe not hate myself as much as, other people who had those values pushed on them, pushed. And, I'm very lucky for that. But a lot of people aren't as lucky. And I think that, even though we have this system in place, I think that as people, we should be smart enough to know that discriminating against people like us doesn't make any sense. I think that we have to do better as a community, because we can't be discriminated against and then also discriminate against other people. That isn't.
Soccer has come out of the closet to tell the world it's gay. A FIFA spokesperson made the announcement at a press conference earlier today.
Soccer is not ashamed of what it is. Soccer is a gay sport.
To be clear, when I talk about the media, your mind probably automatically goes straight to the nightly news. But in the modern world, the media is pretty much everything. It's TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. And these platforms have effectively become the modern person's primary source of information. And because of that, it's caused a major problem, because these platforms they're not designed around journalistic ethics. Not like journalists have very many ethics to begin with, but they're designed around an algorithm that wants engagement. So the values that you see, on these like conservative sites, things that get attention are going to be the things that are constantly pushed out. And those are the things that the algorithm wants to keep feeding. It's specifically built to identify the most polarizing and controversial figures from our community and then use their visibility to weaponize it. And you see this a lot with other communities as well, where they will take someone who's acting, a little bit different, and they will caricaturize them and turn that into what the entire community is, when that's just simply not true. So when you see figures like Lily Cotino or, Tyler Catastrophe that are going viral right now, it makes normal trans folks look insane, basically. And it's kind of a shame because, there are a lot of like good trans creators out there that make amazing videos and make amazing content, art, whatever, but they get overshadowed by these, these outliers, essentially, like people who are not doing the community right. And unfortunately, when someone, less informed looks at those videos, they think that it is who we are. They think that, it confirms everything that they believe. We have mental illnesses, we're insane, there's something wrong with us. That's just simply not true, though. It's not. And, that's not something I'm making up on the spot either. It is like actual, like real, like scientific backing behind it, called the negativity bias. Now, I actually wanted to jump over to the voiceover instead because I feel like I completely, I did not give this explanation justice. So we're going to try it again. Now, this is something that you've probably experienced within your own lives. Now, let's say, for example, someone says that they like your shoes, and you have 5 people say that they like your shoes, and you have 1 person say that they don't. You're probably going to remember the 1 person that said they didn't like your shoes over the 5 people that said that they did. And essentially, that's exactly what this is. It's that humans are biologically, we are wired to remember negative events more than positive events. And why that's a problem is because the news is so negative all the time. We will always remember these bad events that happen. And going back to what I said earlier about, let's say trans shooters, for example, people tend to remember those things more often, not only because of the way that the media portrays it, but because they are negative events associated with a negative group of people in their minds. And when I was looking into this further, I found it very interesting that people who are conservative actually tend to have a higher, likelihood of having this negativity bias within them. Now, I want to say that, all research should be taken with a grain of salt. I will link what I used in the description, but essentially it shows that, some of these conservative people have higher baselines for this negativity bias. So maybe it's not the fact that, they are actively trying to, take away our rights or anything. It might be that they are biologically wired to think differently about things that they perceive as threats. Now, I will be completely honest and say that this kind of stopped my brain for a little bit. Like, looking into this data, it kind of made me step back and think for a second, because if we accept people that are biologically and culturally hyperreactive to unfamiliarity, then it makes them start to look like victims of their own psychology. And in a way, I do think that is 100% true. Some things you just cannot control, similar to how I am trans. I can't control that. That's just who I am. But I think that even though you don't have the initial choice, you absolutely do have the choice to want to change. Now, just like my story about, smoking, I had the ability to change, and I took steps to change my thoughts on that. And, obviously not everything is going to be perfect. I'm not expecting everyone who's homophobic to automatically change, because that's just not realistic in, most times. But I think just because we can scientifically explain something, it doesn't mean that we can tolerate the destruction that it leaves behind. Because unlike, being gay or, being trans, this actually does harm people. You are actively fighting against other people's rights, human rights. And, obviously that's not good. We don't want that. We want everyone to have, basic rights as people. As humans, we are unique, basically. We have the ability to have deep, nuanced thoughts. So at what point does it become, a choice for you to spread misinformation and spread hate and lies on marginalized people. Because I think a lot of people, you know, specifically politicians, they will get on the national news and they will spread blatant misinformation about our community. And a lot of it, obviously, misinformation, it's not true. Like, they don't, but they also, you know, they play into those systems because they know that's exactly the things that will get them reelected. Those are the things that'll get them, you know, popularity, essentially, because it's such a controversial thing. To a lot of them, there is effectively no reason to change because it is something that they currently profit off of. Outrage is essentially currency to them. You know, there's no reason for you to throw the system that benefits you away. And I want you to be honest with yourself for like 2 seconds. Do you really know anything about what any of the politicians or anything they stand for? Like, besides the, you know, the two main issues, which will be either, you know, immigration or abortion, or, you know, a third one obviously is LGBTQ rights. Those are probably like the main three things that you know about them, and those are, you know, easy topics to make people vote for you on. And that's what a lot of these politicians use because they know those are the things that are controversial. It's outrage. That's exactly, you know, what they want. They don't want you to care about anything else. They want you to care about the things that are essentially popular to care about. You're being conditioned essentially to only care about these hot button topics. So if you start to look at everything that's against us, that being the church, the media, and then simple biology, you know, it looks a little hard for us to get out of the current situation that we're in right now. So the real question becomes, you know, is there any hope? And the answer to that is yes, but also kind of no. Now, historically speaking, change takes a very, very long time. And I'm going to take you guys on a history lesson that hopefully you already know by now. But in 1863, you know, as everyone knows, the Emancipation Proclamation, it was signed, and that declared all enslaved people free. And 7 years later, you know, specifically Black people, they gained the right to vote, specifically Black men, actually. And it would be another 95 years until that right was actually even able to be used. It took 95 years of Jim Crow laws in order for change to happen. And even still today, in 2026, we still have racial tensions. You can see it, you know, in everyday media, especially right now with the situation with Carmelo Anthony and the other kid. I'm not sure of his name. I'll put his name on screen. But you can see that there are still racial tensions in this country. And it's been almost, you know, 163 years now. And while it seems like things are, you know, constantly getting worse for us, I think that in some cases, yes, it's getting worse, but I also think that we're also a lot more universally accepted now than we were in the past. It just wasn't a hot, you know, topic before, but we were definitely more accepted than we are, you know, than we were in any time previously. And I think that people are definitely capable of changing their minds. We have seen it time and time again. You know, there were stories of people, you know, not really knowing anything about, you know, us as individuals and meeting someone who's part of the community and changing their mind. But I think that a lot of people also really won't want to change their mind because it is something that they benefit from, or it's something that, you know, they feel like they're gonna betray their faith because they believe in our rights, basically. And luckily for us, there is a small silver lining, and it's that, you know, amongst younger people, religion is starting to lose its grip. So, you know, less people are believing in religion nowadays, especially younger people, which is kind of like one of the biggest things that contributes to homophobia. So with that, you know, going away, I think that within, you know, a couple generations, maybe we'll get to the point to where, you know, let's say like Black people are in America right now, which, you know, obviously it's not perfect, but maybe it's a little bit better than where we are, you know, today. And obviously, you know, we're a long ways away from that, and neither of us will probably be alive to see any of that or experience today when a visibly trans person or like someone who's visibly gay can walk down a street safely without either being, you know, discriminated against or, you know, threatened, attacked, anything. And I don't, you know, say this to leave you with a feeling of doom and gloom, because while there are plenty of stubborn people around, like I said before, there are plenty of people that really do want to change their mind. And I think instead of focusing our energy on those people who clearly will not change their mind, especially a lot of those like religious conservative people that are older. We kind of just have to unfortunately wait for those generations to die out until, you know, we can start pushing for our rights. And obviously I'm not saying that to stop now. We should keep pushing right now, but a lot of the change will happen later on and in the generations that follow us. And this should go without saying, but I want to say that contrary to what anyone says, whatever algorithm or political headline, you know, whatever they want you to believe, we absolutely do matter. Our voices, you know, our art, our thoughts, our lives are no less or more valuable than anyone else's. We absolutely deserve to be here. And there is no, you know, there's nothing that should stop that existence. And I think what a lot of people on the other side often forget is that we're humans as well. We're just as human as anyone else, regardless of what they want to think or believe. And with that, if you have watched this far, I want to thank you. And I think that is pretty much the end of the video. Adios.